John Clarkson, a 78-year-old black veteran, sat quietly at a table in a well-known busy restaurant just down the street of Wellington. Mr. Clarkson was well-dressed, though in a worn but very clean clothes. He held on to a cup of coffee that was just given to him by one of the waiters in the restaurant. The ambience was great, and everywhere seems beautiful. Mr. Clarkson watched and observed what was going on, as different people come in and out while he sips his coffee. This was just to while away some time. Mr. Clarkson, who never imagined what was coming upon him, waited patiently for his son, who at this time was running late to meet his dad at the restaurant. As always, before we continue, please hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so we can continue to bring more inspiring stories your way. Just as Mr. Clarkson's eyes darted between the entrance door and the people chatting about different things in the restaurant, nothing prepared him enough for the humiliation and trouble that were about to envelop him. Mr. Clarkson, being a veteran and someone who has served his country for years, fighting wars in different countries and returning back home to his country, would be shocked if he were told that a day as this would come. As Mr. Clarkson gazed towards the direction of the entrance door one more time, the entrance door to the restaurant was flung open. This time, not by the usual regular customers, but by two police officers who entered and scanned the room as if they were looking for someone. They approached towards the side where Mr. Clarkson was seated and stopped right at his table as he was still sitting alone. The names of the two police officers were Officers Stanley Krebs and Jack Green, as written on their badges. The officers had a very brief conversation between themselves that caused them to laugh out loud, but Mr. Clarkson couldn't figure. This restaurant, even though busy and welcoming to everyone, never have they seen an old black man who doesn't fit into this kind of restaurant. The officers assumed, sitting all by himself before. So they decided they should ask Mr. Clarkson some questions. "What are you doing here, sir?" Officer Krebs asked without hesitation. There was no form of "hello, sir," or some politeness in his tone. The bluntness and tone of the officer sends some signals to Mr. Clarkson that something might have warranted this unjustifiable question and the demand for an explanation. Mr. Clarkson looked straight into the officer's eyes as he dropped the cup of coffee on the table and said calmly to the officer, "I am waiting for someone." His voice was calm but steady, and he did not show any form of discomfort, even as he is being scrutinized. Well, it is quite unusual to see an old man just like you trying to fit in here. I mean, very unusual," the officer said with a mocking tone as he looked at Officer Green, and they both laughed as though there was a joke in the air. Mr. Clarkson bent his head while still seated, trying to process what was funny about him being in that restaurant. Yet he didn't react to the taunt. Instead, he maintained his composure as he raised his head, and then he explained again that he was just having a coffee and waiting for his son. But his calmness seemed to irritate the officers, even the "Moi." Officer Krebs definitely was not satisfied with Mr. Clarkson's response. He slants towards Mr. Clarkson and said, "Your ID." Mr. Clarkson knew that this was not a request but a demand. Nevertheless, he complied and reached for his pocket, brought out his veteran's ID card, and handed it over to Officer Krebs. Mr. Clarkson had carried this veteran's ID card with him for years, and it is a symbol of his service and the sacrifices he had made for his country. But when Officer Krebs looked at the ID, he didn't see a veteran written. He dismissed it instead with a scorn, handed the ID back to Mr. Clarkson, and yelled, "This is probably fake. I need something real to identify you, Mr. John Clarkson, officer." Mr. Clarkson responded. Officer Krebs cared less about what the ID represented, the honor and years of service that would have earned Mr. Clarkson that veteran ID card. Officer Green chimed in support of what Officer Krebs has said. "I bet in your time, you could have been doing some manual labors and washing dishes in restaurants. How could you then have a veteran ID?" He said these words in an attempt to demean Mr. Clarkson's achievements and to stereotype him. The two officers laughed. "Those were the good times when people like Mr. John Clarkson knew their place," Officer Krebs muttered. As far as the officers were concerned, Mr. Clarkson didn't belong in this part of town. Their tone made it clear that they saw Mr. Clarkson as nothing more than an intruder in that neighborhood. As this form of harassment continued, other people and customers who were in the restaurant at the time started to notice what was going on. Some peeped over with curiosity, while others listened with discomfort. But no one said anything. The restaurant energetic conversations quieted down, and the atmosphere became very tense. But still, no one dared to intervene despite the humiliation Mr. Clarkson was subjected to. Mr. Clarkson remained calm. He has been through worse things in his life, and he wasn't about to let these young officers break his spirit. But the officers weren't done with him just yet. I would advise that you pick your things and leave this restaurant now. If you don't, I will have to forcefully remove you, Officer Krebs threatened. Their posture and demeanor suggest that they meant business, and they were ready to back it up with the promise of violence. Mr. Clarkson tried one more time to explain. Officers, I am here, not causing any trouble, but just waiting for my son, who is running late for reason I am not yet aware of at this time. But Officer Krebs cuts him off sharply. He didn't want to hear all the trash coming out of Mr. Clarkson's mouth. To the officers, Mr. Clarkson was just a menace that didn't belong there. They made it clear that they didn't want anyone like him around the restaurant, not even the neighborhood. The confrontation had reached a boiling point. The officers were standing over Mr. Clarkson and waiting for him to voluntarily leave quietly or give them a justification to drag him out. But Mr. Clarkson didn't move. He looked at the officers with a steady stare, with his hands resting slightly on the table. The other customers in the room watched in silence to see what was going to happen next. Mr. Clarkson knew that he was being humiliated for no reason other than the color of his skin. But he also knew that reacting with anger would only give the officers what they wanted and a justification to rough him up. So he remained quiet, hoping that his son would arrive soon and put an end to this unnecessary confrontation. As the clock ticked by, the officers grew more impatient. They are used to their authority being unchallenged, and Mr. Clarkson's calm resistance and dignity was getting under their skin. You have one last chance to leave this restaurant on your own now, Mr. Clarkson, Officer Krebs commanded. Mr. Clarkson did not respond immediately. He only took a sip from his coffee, and when he finally spoke, he repeated again, letting the officers know that he wasn't causing any trouble. He was just an old man waiting for his son to arrive. I have every right to be there, just like anyone else in this restaurant. He spoke. The officers clearly were not expecting this response from Mr. Clarkson, and because of that, they were momentarily taken aback. The other customers in the restaurant were silent too, afraid or too indifferent to intervene, but there was for a fact tension emanating from the conversations that had gripped the room. Mr. Clarkson knew that the situation was now escalating out of control, but he also knew that he couldn't back down, not after everything he had been through in his life. He has faced prejudice and aggression before, but this was different. He had hoped that his service to the country would earn him some respect, but it seemed that to these younger officers, his history meant nothing. Mr. Clarkson remained seated in a calm and dignified composure, even as the officers loomed over him, waiting for the slightest excuse to act. Suddenly, Officer Green reached out and pushed Mr. Clarkson's chair, knocking it over. With a loud crash, the noise startled everyone in the room, and all eyes turned to the scene. The old veteran was forced to stand up, yet he still remained calm. Officer Krebs stepped closer, and without even giving a warning, he began to pat Mr. Clarkson down roughly while he muttered, "I need to be sure you are not hiding or with any weapon." His tone implied that he completely expected to find something suspicious. Mr. Clarkson raised his hand slightly, not in surrender but to comply. After all, he understood as a veteran that situations like this more than often requires a calm attitude, and in most cases, it is the only thing that could keep a bad situation from getting fatal. Still, the anger sparkling inside of him was difficult to ignore. Mr. Clarkson was a soldier for 35 years, a man who has seen combat and survived more than these younger officers could probably imagine. Yet here he was being treated like a criminal in his own country. On the table was Mr. Clarkson's veteran hat, already worn and faded with age, but a symbol of pride and greatness for him. Officer Krebs had picked it up, looked at it with condescension, and then tossed it to the ground as if it were trash. He mocked that old cargo like Mr. Clarkson didn't deserve to wear it. For the first time, anger crossed Mr. Clarkson's face, but he said nothing. He was determined not to give them the satisfaction of seeing him lose his composure. But the officers were not done. The restaurant's customers gasped, and some people stood up from their seats in shock, but still no one intervened. These officers knew what they were doing. They clearly meant business, as they were known around the neighborhood to be bullies. Despite knowing that Mr. Clarkson was not trying to reach for anything harmful, Officer Krebs grabbed Mr. Clarkson's wrist and twisted it behind his back, causing the elderly man to wince in pain. The officers then laughed at the pain Mr. Clarkson felt and joked that he was not as tough as he thought he was. Mr. Clarkson clenched his teeth but didn't cry out. He had endured worse pain in his life, both physical and emotional. But what hurt the most was the sheer disrespect he was being shown after everything he had sacrificed for his country. "You are taking this too far, officer." Mr. Clarkson finally spoke up. "You haven't seen half of the horrors I have encountered. I deserve better than this." Mr. Clarkson added, the veteran was only trying to let the police officers know that he deserved a better treatment, but they saw it as someone asking for war. "How dare you? You think you can tell us how to act? We'll show to you who has power. You are sleeping in a cell tonight for rough handling of innocent officers." Officer Krebs yelled with a scornful tone. "Let's see who will save a nobody like you," he mocked. Wasting no time, he produced handcuffs and slapped them on Mr. Clarkson's wrist. But they did not stop there. Officer Green picked up Mr. Clarkson's walking cane, looking at it. It was a strong but old cane that Mr. Clarkson had relied on for years. Without a second thought, the officer did something unexpected. He snapped it in two over his knee and then tossed the pieces aside. He turned to Mr. Clarkson. "You don't need it anymore. You will be in a jail cell soon." The officer spoke. The two officers started to pull Mr. Clarkson toward the restaurant exit door, but before they could leave, Mr. Clarkson motioned with his chin as he tried to let the officers know about a small card that was still on the table. Officer Green was infuriated by the old black man's behavior. However, he was curious to know what he might be pointing at with his chin. He grabbed the card, completely expecting it to be something unimportant. But when he looked at the card, his face went pale. The card was a simple reservation marker, something that would have meant nothing to anyone else, but written on it in bold letters was the name Commissioner Clarkson. The consciousness hit Officer Green like a punch to the face. The man they had been harassing, humiliating and physically assaulting, was the father of their head, the police commissioner. At once, all the arrogance drained from Officer Green's face. He understood the gravity of their actions. Mr. John Clarkson had lived a long life enough, one marked by service, sacrifice, and resilience. He had been born in the southern part, in a time when discrimination and prejudice were rampant. Growing up, he had learned early on that the world was not kind to people who looked like him. However, Mr. Clarkson had been determined to make something out of himself. When the Vietnam War broke out, he registered in the army, despite knowing that he would be fighting for a country where he was not seen as equal. During the war, Mr. Clarkson had seen things that no man should ever have to see. He had lost friends, faced death many times, and fought with everything he had. His service had been honorable, and he had earned the respect of his fellow soldiers. But when he returned home, he found out that the respect he had earned on the battlefield didn't translate to the civilian world. He was still just that black man in America, subject to the same discrimination and prejudice he had known all his life. Mr. Clarkson had worked hard enough to build a life for himself after the war. He had married, raised a family, and taken pride in the fact that his son Roland Clarkson had risen through the ranks to become the commissioner of police. It had not been easy. Mr. Clarkson has faced numerous challenges along the way, but had never let the world break him. Even when others tried to push him down, he had always stood tall. As Mr. Clarkson was being escorted away in handcuffs by two police officers who didn't know who he was, he couldn't help but contemplate on the irony of the situation. He fought for his country, risked his life for its freedom, and yet here he was being treated like an offender for simply existing and being in a place where there was no restriction order in place. Officer Green gave the card to Officer Krebs, and they are now fully aware of the extent of their mistake. Officer Krebs held the reservation card, and he noticed that his hands were quivering as he realized the gravity of what they had done. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a career-ending blunder. He then let go of the old man and began to stutter out an apology. He tried to explain that they had not known who Mr. Clarkson was, as if that somehow excused their behavior. However, Mr. Clarkson didn't respond. He simply stood there waiting for what would happen next. Officer Green was also seen visibly disturbed. The massive confidence that had fueled their actions was gone within minutes, and it was replaced by a cold reality of the consequences they were about to face. They had crossed a line. They couldn't undo what has been done. The shame of their actions was written all over their faces. As they stood there uncertain of what to do next, the other customers and people who have been too scared to intervene before now watched with both relief and anticipation. Some even pulled out their phones to record what was happening as they sensed that this moment would not end well for the officers. But Mr. Clarkson still didn't say a word. He remained calm as he watched the officers' expressions change from arrogance to fear. He didn't need to say a thing. The name on the card spoke for itself. The officers had just humiliated a man who has served his country, a man who has raised a son to become one of the most powerful figures in law enforcement, and now they would have to face the consequences of their actions. Mr. Clarkson has been through enough already in his life to know that things have ways of working themselves out, even if it isn't always in the way one would expect them to. He had faith in his son, and he knew that justice would be served one way or another. He knew that the officers would remember this day for the rest of their lives. While they were at it, the entrance door to the restaurant was opened, and guess who walked in? It was Commissioner Roland Clarkson. A tall, dark man with a well-built body and a commanding presence that depicted attention immediately. As soon as he entered, the whole room seemed to hold its breath. Commissioner Clarkson quickly scanned the room to assess the situation. He saw his father, Mr. John Clarkson, sitting quietly at the table while the two officers stood awkwardly beside him. Without a moment of hesitation, the commissioner walked over to where his father was seated. He knew what had transpired even before he arrived. Someone at the restaurant had recognized Mr. Clarkson and called him. As Commissioner Thompson approached the table, the eyes of the entire people in the restaurant followed him. He turned first to his father, and his heart broke at what he saw. He could see the stains on his father's clothes, the broken cane on the floor, and the handcuffs still around his wrists. Despite all these, Mr. Clarkson looked up at his son with pride. His expression was calm, still, and unwavering. In a moment, the commissioner turned to the two officers. He didn't raise his voice, but simply asked, "What do you think you are doing?" Officer Krebs and Officer Green, who had been so confident and even asked Mr. Clarkson if he was going to teach them their job earlier, now stammer, and their faces were pale. They tried to explain, but their words stumbled over each other. "We didn't know who Mr. Clarkson was and did not also realize he was the father to Commissioner Clarkson. We apologize, sir." Officer Krebs said. The apologies they gave were weak and full of excuses, but the commissioner was not interested in the excuses. He looked at the two officers with a firm look. His expression says it all. It doesn't matter who Mr. Clarkson was. Everyone or person deserves respect, regardless of their identity or background, Commissioner Clarkson said with a firm voice. He continued, "Mr. John Clarkson is not only a citizen of this great country, but also a veteran who has served his country with honor and dignity. To treat anyone, especially a veteran, in such a disgraceful manner is definitely unacceptable." Officers Krebs and Green listened carefully to the commissioner's words, completely aware of the gravity of their misbehavior and mistake. They could feel the eyes of the entire people in the restaurant on them, and the shame of what they had done was written all over their faces. Nothing more was needed to be said by Commissioner Clarkson. His message was loud and clear. Without further hesitation, he ordered the two officers to leave the restaurant immediately. There was no need for more apologies or further discussion at this time. They were to report to his office first thing in the morning. The consequences of their actions were inevitable, and they knew it. Immediately, Officers Krebs and Green bowed their heads in shame and left the restaurant in silence. After the officers left, Commissioner Clarkson turned to his father. He reached out and gently took Mr. Clarkson's hand on his own to unlock the handcuffs with the key right in his pocket. As the metal cuffs dropped, Mr. Clarkson flexed his wrists. He was grateful to be free of the restraints. The commissioner, now seated across from his father, his expression softened as he looked at the great man who has raised him, then apologized to Mr. Clarkson, his father, for being late. "I apologize, Dad, for keeping you waiting by coming very late, and more importantly, for the way you have been treated by my officers," Commissioner Clarkson spoke. He knew that no amount of apologies given could undo the harm that has been done. However, he wanted his father to know that he would do everything in his power to make it right. Mr. Clarkson at this time was not interested in the apologies. He looked at his son with pride in his eyes. "I am proud of you, son. You handled that quite well," he said. His son had shown grace and dignity under pressure, and that was what really mattered. Father and son sat together for a moment in silence despite the pain and humiliation. There was a sense of peace and pride between them. Mr. Clarkson knew that his son, who has his true gene, was a man of integrity. He is someone who would fight for what is right no matter the cost. The commissioner, on the other hand, knew that his father was a man of great strength and dignity. He is someone who has endured more than what most people could imagine, and has come out stronger on the other side. The whole event did not end when the officers left the restaurant. Words about what had transpired spread so quickly throughout the town and beyond. The members of that community were stunned and livid by the behavior demonstrated by the two officers, and many people spoke out in support of Mr. Clarkson and his family. The police department launched an investigation into the event that transpired under the leadership of Commissioner Roland Clarkson. Officer Krebs and Officer Green were met with immediate disciplinary action. They were suspended for 6 months without pay and were also meant to attend a mandatory retraining program on issues of prejudice and respect. Respect of all people, irrespective of their skin color, race, and background. The awkward event that happened at the restaurant turned out to serve as a reminder to the community and the police department that prejudice has no place in their community. The commissioner's action set a strong example for his officers and the community, showing that justice and respect must always prevail. That particular day and the event that took place for Mr. Clarkson was a difficult and painful reminder of the battles he had fought both in the battlefield and in his home country. But it was also a day that strengthened his faith in his son and the values he has instilled in him. Notwithstanding the adversities, Mr. Clarkson knew that change was possible, and he was proud to have played a part in making that change a reality. Thank you for watching. What are your thoughts on how these two officers treated the 78-year-old veteran who has served this country for years? Was it okay for the people around watching not to intervene? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section below.